So continuing our discussion about the inclusion of students with disabilities in our Catholic schools, and the criticism that always comes is that within our Catholic schools, we don't have the resources to adequately include students with disabilities. And that's a conversation worth having, right? We know Catholic schools across the country, we are always begging and borrowing and stealing and creating creative ways to get things done because we may not have the same money that a public school has or a private school with a large endowment. And so coming to the conversation with the kind of pause button in mind that resources are important is a conversation that needs to happen when we think about inclusion. Now, the reality is that for about 85% of students with disabilities, the resources that it takes to include them in the classroom is minimally expensive. And in lots and lots of cases requires no extra fiscal input. There are students who are more severe, that have low incident disabilities that do require costly supports. And so in the first round of consideration of inclusion, there are some students that will do better with the supports of the public schools simply because the cost of their inclusion is so high. But that really is the minority of students, right? Maybe 15% of students with disabilities would fall into that category. The vast majority of students can be easily accommodated for. There's a quote by a man called Ron Edmondson that I'll paraphrase, but basically it says that we already know how to do everything that we need to know to do to educate all students. And really the only determining factor is how we feel about whether or not those students have been educated in the past. And I think this quote makes a lot of sense, right? What is our attitude about educating students? Have all students always been educated in the schools in this country? The answer to that question is no, right? The only people who have always been educated in this country are wealthy, landowning white males, or the children of wealthy, landowning white males, and more specifically the male children. And so if you are a person of color, if you are a woman, if you are a student with a disability, at some point in our history you've been excluded from education. I like to talk about, I have this old psychology textbook that came out of Columbia's Teacher College in the late part of the 19th century, and there's literally a paragraph in that book that talks about or talks against educating women, that if we educate women they would go insane. And I'm sure that the group of people I'm talking to today may primarily be women, and my guess is that none of you have gone insane because of your education. But we've used rationale like this throughout time to justify not educating certain groups of people. And so this is nothing new to any of us. But when it comes to educating students with disabilities within the context of the Catholic school, there may be a shift in mindset that's necessary to get that ball rolling. The research says that successful inclusion of students with disability really depends on principal attitude. And so I guess the principals that are watching this, I'm looking at you right now, that if you have a good attitude about inclusion, if you feel that students with disabilities can successfully be included within your buildings, that's the biggest factor in making inclusion work. But for teachers, there also needs to be a positive mindset. There also has to be you know what, this is going to be a challenge, and it's not going to be like any of the other challenges that I faced this year, but it's only going to be different in nature. And I think all of us that got into education, for at least some level, got into this kind of work because it is complex work where we're constantly inventing the solutions to the problems that we face on a day-to-day basis. And so the problems, or opportunities is probably a better word, that comes from educating students with disabilities, those opportunities, those problems aren't any different than any other challenges that we face within a school year. It's important though to know where to go when it comes to solving those problems. And for me, the place to begin thinking about how to include students with disabilities in the academic aspect of our work is a principle called Universal Design for Learning, or UDL for short. And if you want to know more about UDL, there's a really good website. It's called CAST, CAST.org. And so you can go to that website and find a lot of information about UDL. And so I'll paint in some broad strokes today. UDL really comes from the work of two academic researchers who've been working in this field for quite some time, and their last names are Rose and Myers. Rose and Myers first came onto the scene researching something called assistive technology. And early in the days of inclusion, so special ed law begins in 1975, and so in the early 80s we see the early days of mainstreaming, that early inclusion. And technology was a means of providing students access to the classroom. And I think I wear glasses. I've had glasses since I was in the first grade when I was 7. And glasses are a form of an assistive technology. They're a technology that makes it a little easier for me to engage in the classroom, to see the board, right? I also think I have a pen in my pocket. One of the other types of UDL, or one of the other examples of UDL would be this, at the base of my pen, there's sort of a rubbery, squishy part that's more easy for my hands to hold on to. And this technology was developed not by pen manufacturing companies to sell more pens, but in the early days you'd have a pencil and have a little foam piece you could slide onto your pencil that made the pencil wider and easier to grip. I remember my mom was an accountant, and so she would bring home, she loved office supplies, and so she'd bring those things home to slide on to our pencils. And those were designed in rehabilitation facilities by occupational therapists who were helping people who had had strokes recover the fine motor skills of writing. And so this was a very specific tool developed for a very specific purpose, yet had the ability to improve an experience for everyone, right? So if I have a lot of writing to do, that sort of squishy piece at the bottom of my pen leads to less fatigue. It allows me to write faster, longer. I haven't had a stroke. My fine motor skills are, I think, average, but it's one of those things that still has a benefit. And so this is where assistive technology comes into play. We invented a lot of things in special education in the beginning that ended up being useful for lots and lots of students. In the early days of inclusion, we talked a lot about adapting and modifying curriculums. And I remember as a student teacher, this happened pretty regularly. I was student teaching in a high school, and the social studies teacher would sort of burn into the special ed classroom at the beginning of the day and give us a paper copy of a test that he was going to be giving later. And it just so happened that some of our students were included in that social studies classroom, and so we needed to modify that test. And we always, after he left, kind of threw our hands up in the air and said, could we have gotten this last night? Could we have gotten it in a non-paper file? And that wasn't the reality, so we began working on that immediately. And some of the things that we did, I remember if there were multiple choice questions on that test, we'd eliminate, let's say, typically there's 4 options on a multiple choice test, so we'd eliminate one of the incorrect options, so a student would have fewer to choose from. If there was a matching section where maybe names and dates were being matched together, we've all drawn those lines across our pages, then we would take maybe a 10 item matching section and break it up into 2 sections of 5. So those were the types of things that we were doing. And while those were great, and while they did provide some more access for those students, that was always still kind of an awkward fit, right? We were moving away from, shoving round pegs into square holes, but really through that accommodation and modification, we were just like sanding down the square. We really weren't creating a new hole or a new way of inclusion. And so Rose and Myers start talking about assistive technology. What types of technology can enhance the experience of a student with a disability within the classroom? And as time goes on, technology advances. And in fact, in my pocket, I've got an iPhone. And the early iPhone, when we talked about apps, the early ad slogan was "There's an app for that." And the power of iOS technology, and I'm sure the same technology in the Android platform, is that there are lots and lots of apps that help someone who engages in society differently be more effective in that engagement. And so I know that if I have a friend who has a hearing impairment and uses sign language, I don't use sign language, but there's an app that I can speak into and then hold up to my friend that will do those signs. And so there's lots of technology that allows that access. As we think about technology, there's two things that we want to consider in developing technologies or finding solutions for students that are based in some technology. And I do want to be clear, technology does not mean that it's something we plug into the wall or as an iPhone or a tablet or a computer. That squishy part of the pen is a type of technology. My eyeglass is a type of technology. But the technology has to fit the environment. And so we think about this. I said that I've got glasses when I was in the first grade, and so I got called four eyes. You know, that joke was old by the time I got to the second grade. That didn't work anymore. But I remember when I was in junior high, some of the girls that I was friends with started getting glasses. And one girl in particular, she rode the same school bus that I did. And I think she was in the fifth grade and she'd gotten glasses, and she conveniently forgot her glasses on the bus every single day, right? She lost them. So I'm sure her parents monitored her to make sure the glasses were on as she left the house, and she climbed on the bus and she took them off and she left them in the seat and she went to school. And I think our bus driver sort of knew what was going on because the glasses were always there where she left them at the end of the day. But we can all imagine that the reason that she left her glasses on the bus is because she was embarrassed by them. They weren't a technology that was widely accepted within the environment. And so those of us who had glasses when we were kids may have gotten made fun of. My daughter has braces right now. As a 16-year-old with braces, this is something that bothers her. I'm going to date this video because we're in the middle of COVID, and she's quite happy to be wearing a mask because people don't see her braces. So that technology has to fit the environment. It has to blend in. It has to be something that the student can use without feeling embarrassed, or that we've painted a sign on them that says, hey, I'm different. The other piece when it comes to assistive technology that we need to think about is that we have to create technology that is maintainable, that is usable in the home, right? So we may have some things that we can use at school and that we as educators have used for a long time and are very comfortable with, but are the parents comfortable with that technology or that device at home? I have a good friend, he and his wife are both my friends. He and I went to graduate school together, and their oldest child, Teddy, had brain cancer as a very young person, and the treatment of that cancer left him with a disability. And so he uses some mobility devices and some other technology. And Doug and I were spending some time together this past weekend and talking about the challenges of special education in the age of COVID. And he was talking about the technologies that are available at school for Teddy's inclusion, but aren't really things that they can utilize within the home. So that's another thing that we need to consider. As Rose and Myers continued in assistive technology, they eventually came to this idea, UDL, Universal Design for Learning. The term Universal Design, comes from architecture. And this is the idea that we design a space, whether that's a public space like a park or a building, or a private place like a home, so that everyone can have access to that space. And that design element is something that we think about from the beginning, right? So I don't know how you all learned to write lesson plans, but when I learned how to write a Madeline Hunter style lesson plan in the 1990s, we were told to write a lesson, and then at the end of that lesson we were given, how would you then deliver this lesson to someone with a learning disability, or say someone with a hearing impairment? And so that design for inclusion was always something that happened at the end. And that's not the way that our instructional planning should work. We should plan for all of our students at the very beginning of our instruction, just like universal design. So an example of universal design from my own life is my mother has multiple sclerosis, and she's not been confined to a wheelchair. But when that disease was discovered in her, one of the things that my folks did was change their homes around a bit, so that if need be, bedrooms and bathrooms could all be on one floor, and that bathrooms could be accessible in a wheelchair. And they have a home in Minnesota where my kids and I spend a lot of time in the summers. And the bathroom, the shower is like a shower stall. There's no step to get into. You're not stepping into a tub. It's more like the showers that I remember from a dorm in college. And it's super handy if a wheelchair is ever necessary. It's also super handy if you've got some small kids that have been in the lake all day and you've got to get them all washed off together, right? So again, it's a design element that was made for one use, but actually ends up being better for lots of uses. And so that becomes universal design for learning. In a couple other videos, we're going to talk about some more detail of universal design for learning, but that's the introduction. That's where it comes from. And again, if you want to learn more than what I talked about here, or what we'll talk about in the next couple of videos, that cast.org is a great resource.